historian, hellraiser. It's Dave Carter, and this is The Dave Carter Show.
Yes, indeed, folks. It is The Dave Carter Show, live stream edition. Welcome aboard, everybody. Delighted to have you here as we begin our adventure today. Now, if the comments that you wish to make show up on my screen, and I'm happy to confess I have no idea if they're going to show up on the screen, but if they do, I will be, of course, delighted to respond to them in real time. That is, unless you start tracing my family tree or something like that and wonder how many branches I hit on the way down when I fell out of the thing. And let me just tell you up front, okay? I hit all of the branches, every single one of them, and I landed on my head. All right. So now that that's out of the way, a quick program update. It looks like in the next week or two that I'm going to have as my guest on the podcast Troy Senik, who was a speechwriter for President George W. Bush and also editor-in-chief over at Ricochet for quite some time. And he's launched a new enterprise. It's called Kite and Key Media. It's fantastic. He's assembled a stellar cast of top minds and researchers to look into the kind of issues that we all talk about, but we only know it on a surface level, right? And we just barely scratch the surface when we ask questions about it. His researchers are digging deep into these topics. For example, they did one recently on green energy and what all goes into that. And I had no idea about the vast majority of what they uncovered. The narration is great. The filmography is unbelievable. And, of course, Troy narrates some of these things, and it's witty, it's informative, it's funny as hell. So they present the data that they don't really take sides. They just present the information. You decide what you want to do with it. And it's great. So we're going to have Troy on the show to talk about this energetic and audacious new effort and just have some fun and a conversation with him. He's a hilarious guy, in addition to being smart as a whip. And it's always fun to banter back and forth with him. So that'll be coming up here in the next week or two, I believe. Now, speaking of going beneath the surface on various issues, you may recall that at our last little adventure here in live broadcasting, I talked about what we can learn from history and used the data of some 50 years worth of the sky is falling predictions with respect to climate science, predictions that proved wrong every single time. The Earth was supposed to freeze, and you and I were going to be ice statues by about now. Then we were all going to starve before the turn of the century, and then we were all going to vanish in a blue steam for some reason. And then, of course, now we're going to melt. We should have melted already, and according to what the predictions were, major cities are supposed to be underwater right now, but they aren't. So we discussed that along with some plausible motives for the continuing cataclysmic predictions made by some folks who have been getting it wrong for quite some time now. So we're going to continue down that line of thought, but on different topics. My goal here is really to achieve the following. Folks, many of you are dear friends. I've known you, some of you I've worked with. I've got family members, some of you I've known for a relatively short time. Some of you I've known since the dawn of the Christian era, and I have enormous regard and affection and respect for each of you. We have a trend unfolding that I would like, quite honestly, to reverse. And I'm not talking about your political affiliation or your deepest held convictions. That's like talking religion or things of that order with someone. If you say that your faith is the right one, that's cool. If you say that your kids or your grandkids are the cutest little urchins in the universe, that's cool with me. No problem at all. What I'm talking about is looking beyond the slogans, beyond the memes, the bumper stick logic, if you will, and peel back the labels and the easy one-size-fits-all diagnoses and solutions so that we can look at the details and see what to make of it. Many of you have heard, for example, of Dr. Thomas Sowell. He's a senior fellow, brilliant economist at the Hoover Institute. He's in his 90s now. He grew up in Harlem. He was raised by extended family members, grew up in grinding poverty, and through his own intellectual exertions and his own natural curiosity became one of the best, brightest, and most prescient economic professors and economists in the country. And early on, he was also a dedicated Marxist. Don't know if you knew that. But as an economist, he owed it to himself and those who he taught and those he would lead to look at the data beyond the rhetoric of class warfare or economic redistribution and things of that order, to look and see what happens. Even if you grant, for example, that the intentions of Marxism or socialism are laudable, the fact is it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. At some point, you have to address the consequences, do you not? Be it in East Germany, Cambodia, the former Soviet Union, Cuba, North Korea, Venezuela, to take a more recent model where people are literally starving. It simply doesn't work. That changed Dr. Solo's mind, as it would, I think, almost anyone with the ability and the desire to really look and take an objective view of things. Now, regardless of whatever egalitarian instincts people felt that if it fueled these initiatives, the ideology is deadly. So we've got to peel back the marketing. We've got to take a look at the slogans, move them aside, and then with a jeweler's eye, to use the title of one of my favorite books, see what's really going on. Otherwise, we continue on our path to becoming what Mark Stein has called a self-moronizing suicide cult, which is what a great swath of Western civilization and even American society are quickly becoming. So as I might say when, faced with a bag of chocolate chip cookies family size, let's dive in, shall we? Let's go and look at a recent headline. We were all devastated last week, obviously, and shocked, and we were saddened by the mass shooting in Atlanta, in which a man murdered 8 people. Here's the headline from CNN, which you can see on the screen. Fetishize, sexualize, marginalize Asian women are uniquely vulnerable to violence. All right, obviously, what happened is horrific. The ghastly murders, the loss of life, which is devastating on so many levels, not least of which are the families of those who were killed. And it wasn't the fault of society. Society didn't make the guy pull the trigger. It wasn't the fault of the gun. It didn't pull the trigger by itself. The responsibility lies with the murderer, the man who pulled the trigger and slaughtered those people. Full stop. I would respectfully submit that to the extent something this horrendous can be understood, with the goal being to lessen the chances of it happening again, we have to peel back the all too glib and the simplistic conclusions and look deeper. For example, the headline of the article itself states that Asian women are uniquely vulnerable to violence. Okay, let's have a look. This is the information from the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, in 2019 on those who have died as a result of assaults. It's broken down by race, and it's broken down by gender. You look on the left-hand side, if you can see it, and I know that the print is small. On the left-hand side, you'll see that we break this down by ethnic groups: Native American, Alaskan Native at the top, Asian Pacific underneath that, Black African American, and then at the bottom, whites. The next column is the gender. The third column from the left there is the number of deaths, broken down by gender. Then we have the population of these various groups as a whole. And on the far right is the rate per 100,000 that people were killed. This is what we use, for example, for homicide rates. When we look at the homicide rate of Memphis and say, yeah, it's higher than Chicago, it's not because more people are killed here than Chicago, because Chicago has a higher population. It's the number of deaths per 100,000, and that gives you the homicide rate. All right? So, looking at the number of deaths per 100,000 from assault for Asian American women, on the right-hand side, you'll see that in females, Asian ladies, the homicide rate is 1.1. For Native American women, it's higher. It's 3.6. You'll see them on the top row. For African American women, it is the highest yet. It is 5.6 per 100,000. That's the homicide rate. And then for white ladies, it is 1.9%. Now again, prefacing this by underscoring the point that any death from assault is a tragedy in and of itself. The fact is that Asian women have the lowest homicide rate of any demographic, meaning that the headline from CNN that they are uniquely vulnerable to violence is literally and demonstrably false. But why, apart from the intellectual laziness, would the headline read that way? Obviously, there's a lot. Let me get to the right page here. Here's the opening sentence again. Let's go back to that article from CNN. The opening sentence says, of the 8 people who were killed when a white man attacked 3 metro Atlanta spas, 6 were Asian women. So there you go. Right from the beginning, from the start, we read the race of the murderer, and presto, the all-purpose narrative is established. And further facts become interesting only insofar as they prove that narrative, because everything, literally everything these days must be force-fed through the narrow lens of race and squeezed into the purported cause of everything bad or inconvenient, from crimes to mathematics. It's all due to white supremacy. Okay, so let's peel that label back and examine the details. The killer, according to his own confession to police and subsequent accounts from his friends and acquaintances, was a religious fundamentalist who repeatedly failed to live up to the religious standards of chastity as he understood them. Okay, as Andrew Sullivan has written, this is evil in the classic fundamentalist sense, a perversion of religion and sexual repression into violence. He appears to have taken out his derangement on what he saw as the source of his temptation. In fact, 2 of the spas he attacked were ones he had previously frequented, according to his ex-roommates, not for reasons of a fetish, but because he saw them as a relatively safer means to get easy sex. Even the New York Times ran a piece confirming that he had been to rehab to treat his sexual impulses. So obviously there's a lot that we don't know and have yet to learn. That thus far there hasn't been a shred of anti-Asian bias found on the part of the murderer. That's what evidence, that's what discovery, trials, and the legal process is for. But that hasn't slowed down the rush to cover the horrid details with an all-purpose, fashionable narrative and repeat it often enough so that it becomes accepted as fact. All right, so let's look a little deeper still, shall we? Here we see the data from the FBI's criminal victimization report, which shows the race and ethnicity of victims and offenders. Both victim and offender. Victim ethnicity is on the far left-hand side column. You'll see that. And we see Asian Americans are at the bottom of that left-hand column of victims, okay? Moving across that row, whites account for 24.1% of attacks on Asians. Blacks account for 27.5%. Hispanics account for 7% of attacks on Asians. And Asians themselves account for 24.1% of the attacks on Asian victims. In fact, and this is kind of interesting, I was looking at this and I just kind of took a double glance. If you look at the spectrum of attacks, you will see that most ethnic groups are attacked most often by members of their own demographic. Okay, for example, you will see with whites, some 62.1% of attacks on whites are by other whites. Ditto with blacks, as we see that blacks fall victim 70.3% of the time to attacks by other blacks. And most of the attacks on Hispanics come from other Hispanics. If you look at this, the only ethnic group that is victimized more often by a different group other than itself is Asians. And according to the FBI's records here, the problem, if you look at it, does not suggest white supremacy. Now, Victor Davis Hanson has looked at the data from the FBI's 2019 crime statistics. He found, among other things, that non-Hispanic whites constitute 65 to 70% of the population of the U.S. and account for 33.1% of what the FBI calls single-bias racial hate crimes. So while they account for 33.1% of racial hate crimes, they constitute 65 to 70% of the population. Blacks in 2019 accounted for 23.9% of single-bias racial hate crimes, but constituted only 12 to 13% of the population. Let that sink in. 12 to 13% of the population accounts for 23.9% of single-bias hate crimes. This suggests that if we insist on looking, and I don't advise doing it, but if we insist on looking at the race of the attacker as a de facto proof of motive, and then look at the populations that are overrepresented in these crimes in proportion to their demographic representation in the population as a whole, then the ramifications become startling, to say the least, and suggestive of something very different from white supremacy. But let me suggest something else. Namely, that this business of looking at everything through the lens of race and looking at everyone and making immediate assessments of that person's history and that person's character or lack thereof on the basis of their pigmentation or ethnicity is simply wrong. It is quintessential, the definition of racism, and has no business whatsoever in a civil society. Okay, that's my position. People are defined by their actions, by their words, by how they treat those they like and how they treat those they dislike. Now, I may be an outlier here as far as some of you are concerned, but I really believe Dr. King got it exactly right when he counseled us to assess other people based on the content of their character and not the color of their skin. That wasn't rhetoric. That wasn't pie-in-the-sky, fluffy stuff. That was a moral standard. I've always found it demeaning and insulting to divide sovereign individuals into various groups and rob them of their individuality, rob them of their spirit, their individual's character, and the gifts that God gave them in favor of looking simply at their skin or their demographic and saying ipso facto what they are, who they are. It goes against everything I've ever been taught, everything I believe to be true. You are a child of God. You have free agency to make your own decisions and choices, period. Oh, by the way, speaking of lumping people into groups, if we're really serious about stopping anti-Asian bias, if the new administration was really serious about fighting discrimination against Asian Americans, it would never have dropped the lawsuit against Yale University for its violation of Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Did you know, for example, that a couple of Princeton economists back in 2009 found that Asian Americans had to score on the SAT, they had to score on average 140 points higher than white students to gain admission to Yale. They had to score 270 points higher than Hispanic students and 450 points higher than black students to get into Yale. In what universe is that even coherent, let alone fair or legal? It's not a universe I want to be a part of, that's for sure. A 2012 study found that while the population of college-age Asian Americans doubled over the previous 20 years, their undergraduate enrollment in Ivy League schools remained unchanged. That make sense to you? If you want to defeat anti-Asian discrimination, there's an excellent opportunity to do exactly that with respect to college admissions. In his book, we referenced Dr. Sowell earlier. In his book, The Vision of the Anointed, Dr. Sowell says the following: "The vision of the Anointed is one in which such ills as poverty, irresponsible sex, and crime derive from society rather than from individual choices and behavior. To believe in personal responsibility would be to destroy the whole special role of the anointed, whose vision cast them in the role of rescuers, people treated unfairly by society. Since no society has ever treated everyone fairly, there will always be real examples of what the anointed envision. The fatal step is to make those examples universal explanations of social ills and to remain oblivious to evidence to the contrary." Look, I don't think it's possible to overstate the vast reserves of goodwill that you folks have toward each other and that you have toward the people that you meet. I know most of you. We should not take that goodwill for granted in public policy or elsewhere. We should not expect people of goodwill to slander those that they don't know, nor should we expect to remain silent, to remain content to be slandered ourselves. A good start would be to look beyond the labels, beyond the easy slogans that, as we've seen, don't always tell the entire truth. Unless and until we accurately identify the problems, we will never take the steps that we need to correct them. Delusions and deflections will only make the situation worse. You don't solve a problem by exacerbating it. And that's my take, folks. Thanks for watching and listening. I look forward to reading your comments and seeing what you have to say. And don't forget presidential speechwriter and co-founder of Kite and Key Media, Troy Senek, will be coming up on the program shortly. Y'all take care. I'll see you soon.